a flash of light. Music started playing, and the young blonde guy sang a song about his deep feelings. The band biggest performed and thanked their audience, but there was silence in the hall, not to mention that there were only a few people. When the band members were returning after the concert, they talked among themselves about it being their last performance because there were no more bookings in the near future. One of them told the leader Juhan that there's no need to reassure others because they all understand the failure of their idol group. Someone still hoped that they would get a chance to release their music album, but suddenly Juhan called out to Hyun, and the latter immediately began praising his performance. Hyun emphasized that if he completes one task well, soon the whole group will rise to the top, and then added that there is a reality show, after participating in which the president will allow the entire group to release their album. Of course, the eyes of the band's leader lit up, and he also felt confirmation from the whole team that the future of their group is in his hands. So he didn't think for long. Juhan told his friends that he doesn't know what awaits him, but is determined to work hard persistently, regardless of anything, and promised to do everything he can. And the reality show called The World Within, with the slogan that it's a healing show, was the most anticipated among viewers because the cast included celebrities, and the organizers were a super star-studded production team. However, 2 days before the start of filming, a loud scandal occurred, and filming became impossible due to the situation surrounding one participant, who was a famous idol. In the film crew, there was only 1 day left to find a replacement, but no one showed up for auditions even for the entire 2 weeks. Therefore, Juhan from the biggest group, considered a failed idol with 0 commitments, volunteered, seizing the tremendous opportunity to join such a show. And now, the guy came to meet the director and the scriptwriter of this reality show, introducing himself and sharing who he is and where he's from. The scriptwriter expressed relief that no one had come for this role, and now they had the chance to meet such a charming young person. She asked if he would be okay with the role of a comedic character. Hyun replied, saying that it suits them perfectly. Even if they become a laughingstock, it will still provide them with a huge incentive for excellent cooperation. Juhan added that they can use him at their discretion. The director and scriptwriter were pleased with this turn of events. After that, the girl announced that Juhan would be acting with 2 actors. She revealed that one of them is Do Eugene, who generally stars in action films and has an elegant image. The other actor, Seon Yohan, she described as a soft and gentle boy, as if plucked from the pages of a love comic. The scriptwriter explained that the 3 of them would live in a mountain cabin without internet. Then, jokingly, she admitted that she doesn't know how to explain that according to the script, they will have to engage in mischief. Juhan responded that he would look 3 times more foolish than she asks, after which he requested to keep him on the team. The girl thanked the singer and then mentioned that it would be very easy for him to get along with Eugene, but Yohan might be prickly and unwilling to do things he doesn't want to. The scriptwriter gave Juhan some tips on how to win over this guy and admitted that she noticed how sweets uplift his mood. So, the singer quickly made a note to bring some treats with him. He then asked if there was anything he should be cautious about in dealing with Eugene. The girl replied that there are no problems at all with this guy and added that in her entire career, she has not encountered any celebrity with such a good character. The scriptwriter even speculated that he is not only polite with the staff but also donates his entire show fee to children. The director interjected into the conversation, noting that there is still one thing to be cautious about with this person. Then, he added that Juhan is probably not at risk and asked not to worry. Just prepare for the shoot. Soon, Juhan, along with his manager, visited the mountain cabin where the reality show shootings were to take place. One guy from the film crew replied that the other 2 actors have already arrived and went to check the living spaces. He then added that since there is still time before the shoot, Juhan can go inside and get to know the rest of the team. The singer's manager praised the blonde for being friendly with everyone and emphasized that he would leave him alone to introduce himself to his colleagues. Juhan responded to his friend, stating that he is not a child and has long noticed that his phone constantly vibrates. They agreed to meet later. Juhan was left alone and went to the lounge, where he found no one but noted the pleasant atmosphere. He assumed that living in such a place would be quite nice for him. On the first floor, he didn't find his colleagues, so he decided to go upstairs, reassuring himself that he shouldn't be so nervous and should be natural. He even bought gifts for the actors he was going to live and work with, but still felt anxious. So he mentally rehearsed their introductions until he heard strange sounds. When Juhun peeked into the clearing, he found Du Eugene and Seon Johan in a rather unattractive situation, and he was horrified to see them intimately involved right on the set. Juhun knew that these two were friends, but he decided that this was too much for mere friendship. He quickly retreated but was noticed by Eugene. The singer decided to pretend he hadn't seen anything because he had no desire to confront these two directly. He also began to worry that if this situation became public, chaos would ensue. However, despite his open-mindedness, he still couldn't understand why they would bring their relationship to such a state, especially on the film set. In the midst of events, Juhun heard someone ascending to this floor and assumed it might be the camera person. The blonde was hit by another indescribable horror, thinking about what would happen and what rumors would circulate if these scenes were captured on camera. He recalled how one actor had already been embroiled in a similar scandal, and now the rest of the cast was engaging in the same behavior. Then, the guy remembered his biggest group and how they believed in their leader and hoped for the release of their album. So, he decided that he couldn't afford to let this show fail while deeming it unacceptable to be involved in such a scandal. With the thought that he must somehow turn this show into a hit, Juhun decided to take action. He spoke to the camera person, introducing himself as the new team member, trying to delay this person. The camera person reminded the blonde that they had already greeted each other earlier and added that there was no need to do it twice. Juhun then began questioning the shooting details of the house before the broadcast. He spewed nonsense to the camera person about which side of the building would look better, attempting to stall him in the corridor in every possible way. The camera person, however, calmly noted that he wasn't planning to set up camp in the hallway, so he was shooting everything in order and pointed to the room that would be filmed first. Juhun was overcome with horror because he well understood the scene the camera person would encounter now, making his last desperate move. The guy asked the camera person to tell him about the specifics of shooting a reality show, admitting that it was his first experience. The camera person simply instructed him to behave quietly. Juhun tried everything to buy time for the two actors, and now all he could do was hope that they had composed themselves. When the two entered the room, the blonde exclaimed with relief that it was an incredibly nice room. In his thoughts, he triumphed, thinking that those two disturbers of his peace had managed to hide. Juhun still wasn't sure what was going on and how they managed to escape, but for him, this show was a precious opportunity to save his music group. Therefore, he had no intention of ruining it with anything indecent. And then, the singer heard intriguing sounds coming from the closet, and needless to say, he went into a state of shock. Juhun was terribly afraid that the camera person would now discover them, and the whole show would fall apart. He concluded that the guys he would have to live with for the next 2 weeks of shooting were behaving like perverted maniacs. The rustling in the wardrobe continued, and Eugene asked Johan to try to be quieter, covering his mouth. Juhun continued praising the camera person for this room, and the camera person even suggested starting the shooting right now. But then, very explicit sounds came from the wardrobe, and Juhun decided that the actors had completely lost their minds. He understood perfectly that if the camera person discovered these two now, the entire show would come to an end, and he began contemplating what to do. The blonde sincerely tried to find a way out of the situation, but he had no idea how to solve this problem, and the indecent sounds from the wardrobe continued to resonate. At some point, they became so loud that the camera person noticed the wardrobe, and Juhun dared to simulate something similar himself. Then, he apologized to the camera person for his agitation, but the young man asked him to calm down and said that he would work in another room today, requesting Juhun to come next time. The blonde was so frightened that he almost choked, and sighing, he left, inwardly infuriated that these two had clearly gone insane, and he should have just kicked them out of the wardrobe. Then he decided to pretend as if nothing had happened. Juhun was immediately overwhelmed not only by disgust but also by a sense of oppression because he couldn't understand how such indecency could occur in a workplace, and he didn't know how to proceed. Johan, in turn, was also outraged at his partner, reproaching him for almost getting caught. Eugene, like a satisfied cat, responded that he found it very thrilling to feel danger at such moments. An anxious Joo-hun returned to the car where Hyun was sitting, and the manager asked him with concern what had happened. The guy couldn't admit that he couldn't stop thinking about what happened and still didn't understand how two guys could engage in such a relationship. Hyun handed the blonde a water bottle and asked him to take deep breaths, drink water, and relax. Joo-hun decided to drink the water with pleasure, but then remembered the scene he witnessed and choked on the water, wetting not only the car but also himself entirely. Hyun ordered the blonde to change, and Joo-hun started taking off his clothes, expressing his indignation that all this happened solely because of those two maniacs. He continued to suffer from the horror that still lingered in his mind. Completely soaked, he undressed entirely and then noticed Eugene, who had just approached the car and was peering inside. He had just decided that it was the right time to get to know the new participant of the reality show and even extended his hand, introducing himself, although the blonde was in shock, to say the least. When the blonde saw Eugene looking at his body, he screamed, covered all his curves, and then, with an apology, decided to close the door and get dressed. The only problem was that the car doors were automatic, so they moved especially slowly. Finally, the third participant appeared dressed and apologized for making the other two wait for him for so long. The blonde announced that he was joining the group and, in connection with that, had prepared small gifts for them. Joo-hun looked extremely disheveled because he dressed in a hurry, but sincerely expressed his eagerness for the collaboration. In response, Eugene emphasized that he was not opposed to working together but would like to adjust his collar a bit first, whispering that he probably was in a hurry to meet them. Joo-hun felt that this person came very close to him, noting at the same time that he had a very good voice and assumed it was related to him being an actor. Eugene also decided to tuck in his shirt, demonstrating how it's done. The blonde recoiled and stated that he could actually do all these actions himself. In the meantime, Johan intervened in the conversation, curious about what they were doing. Eugene introduced the other actor and mentioned that he doesn't talk much, after which he asked the blonde not to worry about what happened before. Johan tried to clarify with Eugene what he was talking about and heard in response that he hadn't told anyone about them, so he could relax. The blonde remained sitting in the garden, filled with shock and shame simultaneously. It seemed to him that Johan envied Eugene and decided that if they were dating, he needed to be more careful and not get close to either of them. Then the guy pondered how he could get between these two at all, and now he concluded that he found himself in a very complicated situation where he saw no way out. Meanwhile, the film crew released another teaser, showcasing the third new participant and stating that it would be a show about people spending 2 weeks in the mountains without the internet or any electronics. Joo-hun headed to the set with a somber thought that he wouldn't find anything he needed and wouldn't even be able to spend time on social media or games. On the other hand, he understood that this would make him friendlier with colleagues, although according to the script, he was supposed to be a bit awkward, so he knew he needed some time to adjust to the role. The show's script claimed it would be an ordinary life, but the blonde somehow greeted this new period of his life with a gloomy outlook. The filming started, and he had to play by the rules even though he wanted to avoid it. He wanted to do everything right and ultimately achieve success for his group. The shooting began immediately, and Joo-hun did everything as in ordinary life. At some point, he announced that he felt like it was some kind of journey because he enjoyed the beautiful landscapes from the windows. The film crew announced that they had finished everything for today, and now they could take a break. Joo-hun stayed alone in the room and approached the wardrobe where indecent scenes took place the day before. Suddenly, he found some fabric sticking out from behind the wardrobe. When he lifted it, he recognized someone's underwear and disgustedly thought that those guys forgot to take some clothing items with them after their antics. For a moment, the blonde shook himself from the thoughts of imagining the encounter with those two in the smallest details and recoiled from his own thoughts. He felt quite embarrassed about what he was thinking, not to mention considering such relationships too strange. Suddenly, Eugene approached him unnoticed, startling the blonde. He exclaimed, asking what he was doing here. The man asked in return why he was blushing, holding someone else's underwear when he was in the room all alone. Joo-hun, trying to explain, replied that he misunderstood him, and Eugene said he came to announce the continuation of the shooting. He added that he would be surprised if he couldn't help him finish some interesting and unfinished business. The blonde shouted that it wasn't his underwear, and Eugene skeptically asked whose it was. At that moment, Joo-hun realized that his interlocutor saw through him and nervously swallowed. Despite everything, the blonde answered and explained that it wasn't his. He just lifted it because it looked out from behind the wardrobe. He wanted to keep this conversation and situation a secret because he didn't want anyone else to find out about what he told his interlocutor. Eugene not only agreed but also added that the blonde looked very energetic, although he was actually terribly embarrassed at that moment. Eugene asked Joo-hun to be careful during the filming and gently placed the unfamiliar underwear in his hand, making the blonde think that he was openly mocking him. Joo-hun looked after this person and wondered what kind of personality he was when everyone said he was a good person, although in reality he was a complete idiot. When the whole group gathered together, Eugene suggested that colleagues communicate less formally, considering that they would live together for 2 weeks, and everyone agreed with this decision. The director reminded the team that all their accessories would be confiscated and asked them to put their phones in the box. He also announced that their luggage would be inspected, but the blonde asked to leave him at least the player, which didn't require the internet. The director stated that any devices had to be confiscated, and Johan decided to eat at least the food he brought with him, which they would surely take away. As soon as the guy heard that any snacks would also be confiscated, Johan decided to feed Joo-hun so that these treats wouldn't end up with others. He also admitted that he wasn't powerful enough to enjoy nature without the internet and his snacks. Eugene turned to the director with a remark that, as far as he knew in other shows, prizes were given for task completion and inquired whether they would be rewarded with snacks or music if they did something similar. The director agreed to these conditions but warned that the tasks would be challenging. The director informed the group that it was the first task of the new team, but it had failed. Now they all had to sleep in one room, after which the film crew bid them farewell until morning and left. The two guys lay down, but the blonde couldn't calm down because the thought lingered in his head. Are those two planning to do something strange here when he's around? Then Joo-hun noticed that a recording camera was on and assumed that everything should be fine. However, everything was not okay with him, and the feeling of discomfort wouldn't leave him alone. He then declared that this seemed like some kind of trip, and everyone began to share childhood travel stories. In the end, the blonde stated that it was very fun to gather at night and talk about everything, realizing that he had been on such trips alone. He silently rejoiced that he had at least some topic for conversation. Joo-hun emphasized that the other two couldn't have fun as they pleased because they would be reprimanded for it. He also stressed that they would desire it even more if he started forbidding them. In light of this, the blonde came up with the idea of playing a game, something like Truth or Dare. Eugene smiled and said it would be similar to the game First Kiss or Unrequited Love, and the blonde confirmed his guess. Then he suggested starting. Johan began asking personal questions, and Eugene, without much thought, joined in. The blonde was horrified that these two managed to turn such a simple game into something intense. Joo-hun scolded himself for forgetting how crazy these two were and proposed talking about something else. However, Eugene concluded that he was joking. Johan admitted that he wouldn't mind having fun, especially because the blonde was against it and even prohibited it. Joo-hun made a joke, but he again didn't understand how he ended up talking about things he shouldn't. In the deep night, he woke up to a strange noise and didn't immediately grasp what was happening. When he understood, he questioned where these two insatiable deviants lost their conscience and why they allowed themselves to do it next to someone who was just sleeping. The first thought that crossed the blonde's mind was why they even decided to engage in such activities in front of the camera. Then he remembered that he had turned it off, assuming in advance that these idiots might do something like this in the middle of the night. Joo-hun couldn't understand why they didn't go to another room, especially since the sight of a single camera should have made them uneasy. However, he realized that they probably didn't care because both of them were completely devoid of common sense. The blonde decided to turn his back to them and not look at what was happening. But when he did, Johan suspected that he had awakened. Joo-hun thought that, being an actor, he should pretend to be asleep. The unrestrained ones were discussing the possibility of moving to another room. The blonde inwardly rejoiced at this thought and silently urged them to leave, appealing to the remnants of their conscience. However, Eugene decided to continue the close conversation with Johann, not going anywhere. Juhan didn't know where to put his ears, and the main question in his mind was why they were doing it so blatantly. Only the blonde decided to pretend as if he hadn't heard anything when suddenly he felt Eugene approaching, checking how awake he was. Juhan wanted to shout at him that it was pure harassment, but continued to pretend to be asleep, afraid that this pervert might suddenly notice his awakening. At the very moment when Eugene was practically exposing the blonde, Johann emerged from the bathroom and inquired about what was going on. Eugene explained that he wanted to help Juhan because he seemed to have woken up, but Johann replied that he was just bothering the blonde to sleep and advised not to disturb him. Johann even suggested that perhaps Eugene liked this type of guy, and inwardly, the blonde thanked Johann for saving his life. Eugene shared how he once heard that if you sprinkle water on a sleeping person, they would dream as if they were at the sea. Then he remarked that if his body reacted like that, it meant he would have very sweet dreams. He even suggested inviting him to join their company, but Johann threw a towel at him and stated that not everyone was like him, asking him not to share his fantasies and to go take a bath instead. Eugene commented on his friend's words as a poorly constructed opinion about him and even admitted that he might genuinely like Juhan. The blonde internally protested against this statement, wanting to shout at Eugene for what he thought of him. However, he reluctantly agreed with Johann's conclusion that Eugene was insane. After a couple of hours, while everyone else was asleep, Juhan still couldn't fall asleep, suffering from both moral and physical shock. He decided to go to the bathroom to restore himself to a normal state, immersing himself under the water. While the blonde was battling with thoughts in the shower, which were ravaging his mind, and simultaneously grappling with thoughts that were pushing his consciousness to madness, Eugene observed an unexpectedly intriguing scene. Eugene understood that sooner or later they would be caught, but he couldn't imagine it would happen on the first day of shooting, although it wasn't particularly important to him. He knew that the blonde didn't have a phone, so, of course, there was no evidence of what happened. Eugene generally considered Juhan a guy who poorly conceals the truth and can't lie, but saw him as an excellent choice for the team. When the director asked for his opinion on the new participant, he replied that this guy was quite charming. The man was very excited that Eugene cast his perverted eye on the blonde, but Eugene insisted that he found him just charming. The director then asked the actor to control himself and not play pranks during the shooting. He reminded everyone that using the phone during the shoot was strictly prohibited and expressed his concerns about their collaboration with Johann, even beginning to doubt whether it was a good idea. Eugene just laughed at this because he intentionally chose an idol in the group who couldn't achieve success. He believed it was excellent if someone kept quiet when given the right role, while the director continued to warn this self-satisfied actor and asked him not to play pranks. Eugene wanted to have a boy in the team who was unaware of temptations because he knew Johann would be pleased with it, so pleased that he even wanted to tease him at first. Now, he watched this blonde with pleasure, although he couldn't hear what he was muttering under his nose. Juhan already suspected that at some point, he himself completely lost his mind and now decided to just freshen up and go to sleep. In the morning, the shooting unfolded again before the untidy Juhan woke up and asked Johann how he slept. Johann replied that the night was great, and at that moment, the blonde caught himself thinking that this guy really looked like he was taken from a comic book cover. Juhan peeked into the kitchen where Eugene was preparing breakfast and asked him how he slept, receiving the expected answer. The blonde confessed that he overslept and now offered the actor his help. However, Eugene replied that he had already finished preparing the food and suggested he freshen up and come for breakfast. Juhan couldn't believe that these two looked entirely like characters from a movie, and he seemed to be the only one participating in the entertainment reality show. When the blonde sat down to eat, he couldn't believe that Eugene had cooked all this food by himself. However, Eugene claimed that he tried to cater to everyone's taste preferences, and Juhan immediately complimented him on his cooking skills. Eugene admitted that he wasn't that great at cooking, but he had learned the skill once, and the blonde didn't have to insist for long before he expressed a desire to have a good meal. When Juhan tasted this food, he announced that his stomach suddenly became upset. Johann concluded that perhaps Eugene couldn't cook after all and asked him about it. The actor replied that he had only been taught to handle a knife properly and work with a frying pan. Johan emphasized that he came here to relax and expressed a wish for Eugene to take care of his stomach enough to prevent it from getting sick. Eugene responded that his food wasn't so bad that everyone's stomachs would get upset. The scriptwriter noted Johan's comment that they, along with the actor, behave as if they are very close to each other. Then she asked Eugene to somehow explain to the viewers that they are just friends. At this moment, the blonde decided to address the situation by stating that they both should be very close friends and asked how it happened. Johan dryly asked in response if he really thought so, and the blonde immediately sensed that this guy didn't like it. In a playful tone, he noted that it might seem so from the side, especially considering that they call each other by name. Eugene began to tell how they first met and where they became friends, explaining why they call each other by name. The actor looked at his friend and kindly said that he could communicate with him even officially when needed. The blonde looked at Johan and couldn't understand why his face displayed such indifference. He even thought that Johan might have problems because of it, although, on the other hand, he felt compelled to ask about it. Suddenly, he realized that the reason for Johan's attitude might be related to the events of the previous day. He concluded that Johan probably didn't like the fact that his guy was getting close to someone else. The blonde wanted to say that it wasn't his fault and overall he was the victim, but he kept his thoughts to himself. As the evening approached, the film crew conducted an interview with Johan, and the director asked how his day had gone. He replied that today he hadn't tried to be a wedge between Eugene and Johan. He even confessed with regret that he never thought such a situation could happen to him, and even more so, he didn't believe that his first kiss, and with a guy participating, could happen on this show. 6 hours earlier, Johan decided to invite the blonde to the kitchen, so this time he could make him a snack. Eugene suspected that, unlike some others who dropped hints, this guy knew how to cook. It was hard for the blonde to believe that Johan suddenly changed his attitude toward him 180 degrees just because he made a tasty breakfast. Although it's worth noting, he had 3 years of experience in cooking fried rice and knew how to prepare food deliciously. Johan asked Eugene to bring some meat because someone threw it away, and he went to get it. In his thoughts, he was pleased that Johan still preferred him. On that day, the film crew prepared a task, which involved transferring a piece of paper from one mouth to another. Then they discussed that if they succeeded in the task, they would get meat for their lunch. The director announced that the amount of meat they would receive for lunch depended on the number of pieces of paper they successfully passed to each other. He urged the guys to compete well for the opportunity to get a great lunch. The trial began, and the blonde observed its beginning, thinking that all of this reminded him of yesterday's events, and to be frank, it seemed more like a real kiss. Now it was his turn, and he set himself to simply get a piece of paper. However, the paper slipped, and as a result, their lips touched with Eugene. The blonde, shocked, fell to his knees, even more astonished that he had just experienced his first kiss. When Johan mentioned it, Eugene was surprised by the information, while Johan was outraged that the two of them were kissing instead of completing the task. Meanwhile, time ran out, and as a result, they received only sausages for completing the task, with the statement that it was more of a bonus for their first kiss. Johan was saddened to realize that their lunch would now consist only of sausages, but Eugene even expressed joy, trying to reassure the blonde with his words. Johan became curious, wondering if he really just had his first kiss now, then even doubted it because he thought it couldn't be the case with a solo singer. Eugene apologized to the blonde for taking his first kiss, and the guy replied that he was really okay with it and noted that it happened unintentionally during the game, so he decided not to dwell on it. Eugene offered the blonde to eat his sausage instead of an apology, and he took a bite but felt a terribly awkward atmosphere. Johan told the blonde that he was willing to sacrifice his sausage and even feed him, but the guy asked everyone to eat their portions independently. Eugene suggested talking privately about their situation and asked the blonde how he felt about their kiss. He argued that he was curious to know what a person feels when kissing for the first time, not just anyone, but with him. However, the guy asked not to pose such questions, after which their gathering came to an end. That night, the blonde had to sleep alone since there were 2 rooms in the house, and this time he felt even happy. Johan recalled their last conversation and called Eugene crazy. not understanding how one could be so cruel to their partner and dare to inquire about his impressions of the kiss in Johan's presence. At the same time, he admitted to himself that it was gentle and even a bit pleasant. Then the blonde went into hysterics out of frustration, not understanding why Eugene approached him like this and what he wanted. He even concluded that Eugene seemed to be teasing him. Finally, the guy calmed down, reflecting on how he was overthinking everything and decided he didn't want to date someone as handsome as Johan. He finally resolved to go to sleep because all these thoughts were overwhelming him. In the middle of the night, the blonde woke up with a desire to drink water and went to the kitchen. However, halfway there, he stopped dead in his tracks. He heard the familiar sounds again and peeked around the corner, where he saw those two perverts engaging in their usual activity. He was terribly outraged that they were doing it in the kitchen when they were supposed to stay in their room where no one would disturb them. The blonde decided that nothing would surprise him anymore and intended to go back to his room until he realized he had been noticed. On the third day of filming this reality show, Johan understood that this entertainment show was not the spectacle he should have participated in because, in his vision, everything was supposed to be completely different. With the thought that these two were undoubtedly out of their minds and had no sense of shame whatsoever, he staggered back to his room. Johan tried to understand why these guys so desperately wanted him involved in their relationship, although he later decided that he shouldn't expect anything different from these lunatics. The blonde came to the realization that he couldn't endure this situation on a constant basis. As a result, he concluded that this situation needed to be discussed collectively, and a common decision should be reached. In the end, the guy returned to the kitchen with a determined desire to talk to the team, despite the fact that they were enjoying each other's company in the heat of the moment. Eventually, all three sat down for a negotiation, and Johan initiated the conversation by asking the blonde to answer his question, promising to fulfill any request afterward. The actor inquired from the third participant if he was unoccupied, but the guy was offended by such a straightforward question. Johan kindly explained his interest, stating that it was a desire to become the first experience in his life, after which he asked not to worry and to choose any wish to his liking. The blonde shouted that he would never allow it, rejecting the proposed options by stating that he disliked everything about it. Johan got angry and stated that he didn't like any of it, and he had no intention of doing anything similar with them. Eugene interjected into the conversation and explained that it's crucial to learn from an experienced partner because it's very challenging for him to find someone who would teach him better than they could. The blonde only managed to shout that he doesn't need to learn anything, but the two relentless deviants kindly offered their services. Johan, even more outraged, replied that he doesn't want to do this, especially since they both are in relationships, but the guys started to deny it, claiming it wasn't the case. The blonde didn't understand their reaction and even decided to ask why they were laughing. And they continued to admire him, insisting to join him in bed as their first teachers. The blonde stated that he gathered them to ask not to be too friendly with each other in front of the camera. But Eugene didn't understand why they couldn't do that when the camera was off and reminded them that it was specified in the contract. He pointed out that the film crew respects their confidentiality, and therefore, all actions will remain a secret, just like their relationships. Then the blonde learned that these two were simply helping each other survive in this way, after which he shouted in response that he doesn't want to engage in such mutual assistance with them. On the next request from these two maniacs not to involve him in all these gatherings, Johan sadly noted that, in that case, the fun is cancelled. These events happened the day before, and the next morning their first shootings ended, but now the blonde was between two eager actors who were doing their best to get his body. He understood that he had to endure such pressure for another 4 nights, so he could barely stand on his feet. The scriptwriter noted that the third participant had integrated well into the team, and Eugene confirmed that compared to previous days, they had become much closer to each other. When they were shooting, everything was more or less normal because these two deviants didn't allow themselves to do anything shameless in front of the cameras and in the presence of other people. But when night fell and everyone went to bed, these idiots, as the blonde continued to call them, became wild. The guy tried to reassure himself that he could endure this until the end. It's worth mentioning that he had to spend this night with Eugene. The actor addressed him and playfully whispered that he might fall out of bed if he kept tossing and turning. but the blonde still held on and simply replied that he was comfortable. Eugene sensed that Juhan was somewhat scared and asked him about it, then inquired if he ever thought that he might be eaten by him. The blonde wanted to reply that it's perfectly normal to take care of oneself, but wisely kept silent. Then, Eugene stated that he could sleep peacefully because he had no ill intentions towards him. The blonde didn't know if he could trust this person, as he was capable of bothering him even in his dreams. Because of this, he feared that he wouldn't be able to fall asleep, needing to remain vigilant. Morning arrived, and Juhan was surprised to find his body intact and safe. He caught himself having a terrible thought, almost regretting that nothing happened. However, he quickly came to his senses and expressed joy that everything turned out fine. Today, the task before the guys was to gather potatoes, and in return, they would receive money to make necessary purchases at the supermarket the next day. The boys agreed to divide the work, and whoever collected the least amount of potatoes would be in charge of cleaning the house. Johann disliked this job as well as the clothes they made him wear. However, Eugene claimed that it helped him feel like a real gardener. The blonde worried that such clothing would be challenging to clean if it happened to get dirty. Johann emphasized that he would simply throw it away, as he was, after all, an actor. The blonde thought that even his clothing looked odd, but once again, chose to keep his thoughts to himself. Johann couldn't work, and at some point, Eugene approached him to offer his help. However, he asked to be left alone. In the meantime, the blonde finished his work and joyfully announced it. Eugene asked the singer how he managed to complete the task so quickly, and he emphasized that he simply tried very hard to get the first place. The blonde even offered his help to the actor who couldn't finish in time, but he refused the assistance. Eugene noted that he also offered Johann his help, but he declined, insisting he could handle it himself. Eugene suggested the blonde go to the shower first and relax. Satisfied, Juhan agreed and asked the guys to hurry with completing the task. When the blonde left the shower, the scriptwriter announced they had encountered problems. She added that Johann suddenly felt unwell, so they were interrupting the shooting for a while. The film crew asked Juhan to take care of Johann, and he turned to the cameraman, requesting that they leave his room once they finished shooting. Johann asked the blonde to turn off the stationary camera, although he thought it wouldn't bother them much. When he went to the equipment because he realized that filming a sick person really crossed all boundaries, he caught himself thinking that the air conditioner in the room was too noisy and would disturb the patient. When the blonde, unsuspecting, turned to the sick person, he saw such an unexpected scene that he sat down on the sofa in dizziness. The patient, so to speak, begged to disconnect the device that was immersed in him by the other villain and asked to find the key to remove the belt.